The shape in the blizzard wasn't supposed to be there. No one could ride in that, but she did. A woman on a horse materializing out of the whiteout like a ghost, her only cargo a small leather satchel of medicine. She saved a child's life that night, and then she vanished. For months, the rancher searched for any trace of the stranger who braved a killing storm. What he found was a story buried for a century, the true story of the women who rode into the dark alone and why history tried to forget them. This isn't a folktale, it's a fragment of a hidden history. For generations across the American frontier, women were the emergency medical system, riding alone through impossible weather to deliver Bobby's medicine and hope. Their names were rarely recorded. Their acts were treated as simple duty, not heroism. So when one vanished into a storm after a single miraculous rescue, she left behind a question that cuts to the heart of our past. Why were the women who saved countless lives the very ones history was most determined to forget? To understand that night, you have to go back to Kentucky, 1925. That's when a woman named Mary Breckinridge founded the Frontier Nursing Service. The statistics were brutal. In some remote Appalachian communities, 1 in every 100 mothers died in childbirth. Doctors were days away over mountains. So Breckinridge recruited nurses, women who were also certified midwives, and put them on horseback. Their territory was 500 square miles of the most rugged terrain east of the Mississippi, creeks without bridges, trails that vanished in snow, and hollows so isolated that the only way in was on foot or hoof. They carried everything in their saddlebags: sterilized instruments, morphine, antiseptic, and hope. The locals called them the angels on horseback. But here's what the official histories often skip. These women weren't just medical providers. They were a secret emergency network, operating in a world that refused to formally acknowledge their expertise. Male doctors in cities dismissed them as untrained helpers. Medical journals wouldn't publish their findings. Yet by 1930, the Frontier Nursing Service had slashed the maternal death rate in its district to a fraction of the national average. They proved it worked, but the system had no room for their names. One of those nurses was Eleanor Vance. The service's ledger from 1928 lists her simply, nurse midwife, assigned to Red Bird River District, Horse, Jasper. That's it. No photograph in the archive, no letters home, just a name in faded ink. But in the oral histories and the stories passed down through families she served, a picture emerges. She was in her late 20s. She had dark hair. She was, by all accounts, unshakably calm. In the spring of 1929, she delivered 13 Bobbies across 7 different mountain homesteads. In the summer, she treated a typhoid outbreak that would have killed an entire family. She was known for never turning back, no matter the weather. Because in the mountains, weather wasn't an inconvenience. It was a wall, and sometimes it was a weapon. The call came in on the afternoon of February 12, 1930. A rancher named Thomas McCullough had ridden 18 miles to the nearest outpost, his face raw from the wind. His 4-year-old boy, Samuel, had a fever so high he was shaking uncontrollably. It had come on fast. The local remedy, willow bark tea, had done nothing. Pneumonia was the fear. The nearest doctor was in Hyden, 3 days' ride through passes that were already choked with the season's worst snow. But Nurse Vance was closer. She was at a cabin 10 miles from the McCullough place. The problem was the sky. A storm was building, the kind the old-timers called a smothering snow. The man at the outpost begged the rancher to wait. It was suicide to send a rider. McCullough said his boy wouldn't last the night. The message reached Eleanor Vance just as the first flakes began to fall. She had a choice. Protocol said to shelter in place. No one was expected to ride into a blizzard warning, but the medical calculus was different. A child with a high fever in an isolated cabin with no other help coming for at least 72 hours. That wasn't a choice. It was a diagnosis. She packed her satchel, quinine for the fever, aspirin, a stethoscope, mustard plaster for congestion, and a small vial of digitalis, just in case the child's heart was under stress. She told the family she was staying with to bolt the door behind her. Then she mounted Jasper and turned him into the wind. What followed was a 7-hour ordeal that defies simple telling. The snow didn't fall, it flew sideways, a solid, screaming white wall. Visibility dropped to zero. She navigated by memory, by the feel of the trail underfoot, by the rare glimpse of a familiar tree bent at a specific angle. Jasper, a sure-footed mountain horse, pushed forward belly-deep in drifts. Twice, she dismounted and led him, breaking the trail herself, the leather satchel clutched under her cloak to keep the medicines from freezing. The temperature plummeted. This was more than a rescue mission. It was a race against two clocks, the storm's fury and the fever burning through a little boy miles away. She arrived at the McCullough cabin sometime after midnight. Thomas McCullough would later say he'd given up hope, was just sitting by the fire holding his son, when a sound cut through the wind's roar, the slow, heavy thud of a horse's hoof on the packed snow of his porch. He opened the door to a figure so caked in ice she seemed carved from the storm itself. She didn't say a word about the journey. She stepped inside, shed her frozen cloak, and went straight to the child. For the next 3 hours she worked. She broke the fever with quinine. She listened to his lungs, clear for now. She kept him hydrated, spooning melted snow into his mouth. By dawn, the storm still raged, but the child's breathing was even. He was sleeping. She had won. Thomas McCullough, a man of few words, offered her everything he had: food, a bed, his eternal gratitude. She accepted a cup of bitter coffee and waited just long enough to see the boy wake, confused but alert. Then she said she had to check on another family down the creek. She refused an escort. The storm, she said, was breaking. She repacked her satchel, wrapped herself back in her damp cloak, and rode back into the gray morning. Thomas McCullough watched the horse and rider dissolve once more into the swirling snow. He assumed he'd see her again at the spring clinic. He never did. Leaner Vance was reported missing 4 days later when she failed to arrive at her next scheduled stop. The Frontier Nursing Service launched a search. They found Jasper, her horse, wandering saddleless near a swollen creek. The bridle was snapped as if torn. Of Nurse Vance there was no sign, no body, no torn clothing, nothing. The official conclusion was tragic accident, a fall from the horse, a tumble into the rushing water, a loss to the wilderness. She was listed as deceased in the line of duty. A brief, sorrowful note was added to the ledger, and that, for nearly a century, was where the story ended. A heroic ride, a life saved, and a mysterious, quiet exit, a closed case. But Thomas McCullough's son, Samuel, lived a long life, and he had a son who had a daughter. And in 2019, that granddaughter, a historian named Clara McCullough, started asking questions. She wanted to honor the woman who saved her grandfather. She went to the Frontier Nursing Service archives, expecting to find a file, a photograph, a letter, something to put a face to the name. What she found was a void, the ledger entry. A single, blurry group photo where a woman in the back row might asterisk be a Leaner Vance. No personnel records, no next of kin listed. It was as if, after her death, someone had meticulously scrubbed her from the institution's memory. How does a woman who served for years, who saved countless lives, simply evaporate? Unless her disappearance wasn't an end but a beginning. Unless someone needed a Leaner Vance to vanish. Clara McCullough's search began with a simple premise: find the woman, honor her story. She started where any historian would, with the paper trail. But the Frontier Nursing Service archives in Wendover, Kentucky, were a maze of polite obstruction. The head archivist, a genteel man in his 60s, expressed sympathy but firmness. Nurse Vance's file, he explained, was likely part of a batch of records lost in a basement flood in the 1970s. A tragic accident. When Clara asked to see the donation logs, the meeting was cut short. When she filed a formal records request, it was denied on the grounds of protecting patient confidentiality, even though she was asking for personnel records, not medical files. It was a brick wall, wrapped in velvet. But Clara had a weapon her opponents underestimated. She was a McCullough. Stubbornness ran in the family. She decided to go around the institution. If the official record was silent, she would listen to the people. She spent the next 6 months driving the back roads of Leslie and Clay counties, knocking on the doors of old farmhouses, sitting at kitchen tables with children and grandchildren of the families the Frontier Nursing Service had served. She wasn't looking for facts about the disappearance. She was looking for memories of the woman, and the stories poured out, not from official reports, but from the recall of people now in their 80s and 90s, who had been children when the nurse on the big horse came. An old man named Arlo, whose breech berth she'd managed alone in a cabin with no light. A woman named Bate, who remembered Nurse Vance pulling a rotten tooth with a pair of sterilized pliers, her hand steady as a rock. They described her voice as low and calm. They remembered she always carried a specific type of peppermint drop in her pocket for scared kids. They called her Miss Alina. And in every story, there was a consistent, puzzling detail. She asked questions. Not just about symptoms, but about the land, about water sources, about strange illnesses in livestock, about miscarriages in cattle. She took notes in a small, leather-bound book she kept separate from her medical charts. Then, in the fall of 2019, Clara got a call from a woman living in a retirement home in Tennessee. Her name was Iris, and she'd been a young girl in 1929, living on a neighboring farm to the McCulloughs. She had a memory from the day asterisk after the blizzard. She'd been out checking rabbit snares and saw a man on a horse, not a woman. He was riding fast, coming from the direction of the creek where Jasper was found. She thought nothing of it. Men rode horses all the time until she saw his face when he passed close. He looked, she said, scared, angry. And he wore a suit under his winter coat, which was strange for those parts. When Clara asked if she'd ever told anyone, Iris said she mentioned it to her mother, who told her sharply to forget it, to not bring trouble. A man in a suit, riding from the scene of a nurse's disappearance, looking scared. This was the first thread that didn't fit the tragic accident narrative. Clara took this sliver of information and went back to the historical record, but with a new question. Who, in 1930, would have wanted a frontier nurse to disappear? The answer began to take shape not in Kentucky, but in newspaper archives from Frankfort and Lexington. In the late 1920s, a political battle was raging in the Kentucky State House. It was called the Medical Practice Act. On one side were the established, male-dominated state medical associations, pushing for stricter licensing laws to professionalize medicine, and they argued, protect the public. On the other side were the folk healers, the midwives, and the public health advocates who argued these laws would criminalize the only care millions of rural Americans had. The Frontier Nursing Service was caught in the middle. They were trained, but they weren't doctors. Their success was a public relations nightmare for the old guard. Every baby they delivered safely, every fever they broke, was proof you didn't need a medical degree from Johns Hopkins to save a life in the hills. The service was a living rebuke to the entire power structure. And in 1929, a state senator from the coal country, a man named Thaddeus Galt, launched a very public crusade against them. He called them interlopers and dangerous meddlers. He gave speeches claiming their success rates were fabricated. He introduced a bill that would have made their work illegal. His financial backers, according to editorials of the time, were rumored to be pharmaceutical interests and medical colleges who saw the frontier as untapped territory. Galt's campaign hit a wall of public affection for the nurses. The people loved their angels on horseback. So by early 1930, his strategy shifted from public denouncement to private pressure. Discredit them, find a scandal. Clara felt the pieces click into a terrifying new alignment. What if Alina Vance hadn't just been asking questions about sick people? What if she'd stumbled onto something that could create a scandal? Something that could give Senator Galt the ammunition he needed to destroy the entire Frontier Nursing Service. Her mind went back to the notes the old-timers mentioned. Questions about livestock, miscarriages in cattle. A specific, chilling thought formed. In the 1920s and 30s, the leading cause of miscarriage in cattle, and a mysterious, wasting illness in humans who drank their milk, was called milk sickness. It was caused by cattle eating white snake root, and it was a frontier midwife, Anna Pierce, who had first made the connection decades earlier, only to be ignored by the medical establishment for a century. What if Alina Vance had rediscovered a cluster of cases? What if she was documenting a local outbreak, tracing it to a specific pasture? And what if that pasture belonged to someone powerful? Clara's search turned urgent, paranoid. She began looking for land deeds from 1930 around Red Bird River. She was looking for a name connected to Thaddeus Galt. What she found instead was a corporate entity, the Red Star Land and Cattle Company. It owned thousands of acres in the area. Its listed director was a lawyer from Lexington. But its articles of incorporation, buried in microfilm, listed a single, silent investor: the Kentucky Medical Advancement Fund, a lobbying group founded by none other than Senator Galt's biggest donors. It was a circular, hidden ownership. Galt's backers owned the land. She then tracked down the diary of a county public health officer from that era, donated to a small historical society. In an entry from late 1929, he wrote, "Called to consult on a strange morbidity at the Red Star holding pens. Cattle thin, calves stillborn. Manager dismissive, says it's bad feed. Ordered quarantine but doubt it will be enforced. Political pressures." The entry was followed, 2 weeks later, by a terse note: "Quiet order from Frankfurt to drop the Red Star matter. Advised to focus on typhoid." Alina Vance was riding through that district. She was asking questions about livestock illnesses. She was taking notes. And now, a powerful political machine with a direct interest in silencing any scandal connected to that land had a motive to make her stop. The tragic accident theory was crumbling, but Clara still had no proof, only circumstantial evidence and a ghost story from an old woman. She needed the one thing the institution claimed didn't exist: Alina's own record. In a final, desperate move, Clara didn't go back to the main archive. She reached out to a former Frontier Nursing Service nurse she'd interviewed, a woman named Agnes who'd served in the 1950s. Over tea, Clara laid out her theory. Agnes listened in silence for a long time. Then she said they were careful. They knew they were targets. Some of them kept 2 sets of books. Clara asked what she meant. Agnes wouldn't elaborate, but she gave Clara a name: Edna Forsyth. Edna had been the service's head administrator from 1928 to 1940. She was a force of nature, and she was fiercely protective of her nurses. She died in 1982. But, Agnes said, her estate was handled by her grandson. He lives in Berea. He might have things that never made it to the official archive. Clara drove to Berea the next day. Edna Forsyth's grandson, a retired teacher, was wary at first. But when Clara explained she was trying to honor a nurse who'd been forgotten, his demeanor softened. He led her to his basement, to a stack of dusty trunks that hadn't been opened in decades. In the third trunk, under bundles of old uniforms, she found it. A simple cardboard box labeled "Personal Correspondence," EV. Inside were not letters, but a series of small, leather-bound notebooks. Alina Vance's field diaries. The official record that was supposed to have been lost in a flood had been secretly preserved by a boss who didn't trust the system. Clara's hands shook as she opened the first book. The entries were meticulous, clinical, but in the margins a different story emerged. In the fall of 1929, the notes changed. The medical observations were interspersed with geographic notations. Family on Hickory Ridge, 2 stillbirths this spring. Their creek runs past north pasture of Red Star lot. Child with tremors wasting. Mother says cow milk tastes bitter. Their well is downstream from Red Star Spring. She was mapping the poisoning. She was building a medical case. Then she found the entry dated February 10, 1930, 2 days before the blizzard ride. It was brief and utterly damning. Met with local man J. Miller, who tends stock for Red Star. Confirmed. Manager knows, told to keep silent. Miller fears for his job. Says he will speak if I find a bigger law than the senator. Must be careful. This is not just sickness. This is a crime. Alina Vance knew. She knew the cattle were poisoned. She knew it was causing human illness and death. And she knew the management was covering it up under political protection. She was planning to expose it. She just needed to survive one more emergency call, to deliver medicine to a sick child. to do her duty. The final entry in the diary was dated February 12th, the day of the blizzard. It was only 3 words written in a hurry, the ink smudged. Riding to McCullough's, and then nothing. The rest of the book was blank. Clara sat on the basement floor, the diary in her lap. The heroic angel on horseback was also a threat to a corrupt land scheme, to a political machine, to a powerful senator's war on her entire profession. She had ridden into that blizzard carrying 2 things: medicine to save a boy and knowledge that could ruin powerful men. Only one of those things arrived at the McCullough cabin. But the diary still didn't answer the core question. It gave motive. It made the accident look like a murder. But how and who? The man in the suit Iris saw, an agent of Red Star? Or was the conspiracy deeper, closer to the service itself? Someone who knew her route, who knew the storm would provide the perfect cover. Someone who understood that a nurse lost in a blizzard was a tragedy, but a nurse silenced for exposing a scandal was a revolution waiting to happen. Clara had found the why. Now she had to find the how and the who. And as she closed the diary, a cold realization settled over her. Eleanor Vance's story wasn't buried by time. It was buried by design. And the people who designed that burial might not be finished, because Clara McCullough was now holding the blueprint. Clara didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table, the diary open, a modern map of Kentucky spread out beside it. Using Eleanor's notes, she began plotting the locations of the 6 families. They formed a grim cluster, a poisoned crescent of land that followed the waterways downstream from the Red Star Company's primary grazing pastures. It was a map of culpability, but a map wasn't proof. She needed to confirm the source. The next morning, she called an old friend from college, a geologist named Ben. She asked him a hypothetical. If she had soil and water samples from a specific area, could he test for historical toxins like tremetol from white snake root? Ben said yes, but it would be expensive and take time. Clara didn't have much of either. She felt a clock ticking in her gut. She packed a bag, took the diary, and drove back to the hills. Her first stop was the descendant of Jay Miller, the stockman Eleanor had mentioned. He lived in a trailer at the end of a long gravel road. He was a wary man in his 70s, but when Clara showed him the diary entry with his grandfather's name, his demeanor shifted from suspicion to a deep, weary sadness. He confirmed the story had been a family secret. His grandfather had been paid off by Red Star's manager after Eleanor disappeared, a small sum and a threat to move on. The old man had died bitter, he said, but silent. He was scared of the suit men, the descendant said. Said they weren't from around here, said they had law in their pockets. Clara pressed him about the suit men. He didn't know names, but he remembered his grandfather mentioning one of them had a bad hand, 2 fingers permanently curled like a claw. It was a specific, identifiable detail, a deformity. Clara stored it away. Her next move was reckless, but she was running out of patience. She went to the county clerk's office and requested the original property transfer records for the Red Star Land and Cattle Company from 1931. She was looking for a name, any name, behind the corporate shield. What she found instead was a legal notice of dissolution, filed in 1934. The reason stated, economic non-viability, but the timing was suspicious. It was dissolved just 4 years after Eleanor's disappearance, right when the political pressure from Senator Galt's anti-nurse campaign mysteriously evaporated. It was as if the land had served its purpose, to create a crisis, to discredit the nurses, and was then folded away. But as she was photographing the dissolution papers, the clerk, a middle-aged woman who'd been watching her with quiet interest, slipped her a post-it note. On it was written a single word, checkbox. Puzzled, Clara looked back at the dissolution document. At the very bottom in small print was a checkbox next to the phrase assets transferred to benefactor. The box was checked, but the line for the benefactor's name was blank. Standard practice, maybe, or a deliberate omission. The clerk caught her eye and gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head, a warning. Clara took the hint, thanked her, and left. The message was clear. The trail didn't just end. It was erased. Frustration was boiling into anger. She had a motive, she had a map, She had a shadowy company and a crooked senator. But she still didn't have the asterisk. How did they stop Alina Vance? A fall in a blizzard was too convenient, too clean. She needed to understand the mechanics of the disappearance. On a hunch, she drove to the regional library and pulled every local newspaper from February and March of 1930. She wasn't looking for stories about Alina. She was looking for anything else, and she found it. A small, 3-paragraph item in the Asterisk Hazard Gazette dated February 21st, 9 days after the blizzard. The headline, "Freak Lightning Strike Sparks Fire at Hayden Livery." The article reported that a late-season lightning bolt had hit the stable in the middle of a clear, cold night, burning it to the ground. One casualty, a horse named Jasper, the Frontier Nursing Service horse. The article quoted the local sheriff, saying it was a one-in-a-million act of God. But Clara's blood ran cold. Jasper hadn't died in the creek or been lost in the wilderness. He'd been recovered. And then 9 days later, he was in a stable that was struck by lightning in a snowless month. And that stable just happened to burn down, destroying the one piece of physical evidence that survived the blizzard. That wasn't an act of God. That was a cleanup. Someone had retrieved the horse and then needed to erase it. The accident now had a second chapter. And it proved the cover-up was active, deliberate, and local. She drove to Hayden, to the site of the old livery. It was a hardware store parking lot now. But in the local historical society, a volunteer found her a photograph of the livery before the fire. And in the grainy background, standing in the doorway, was a man. The photo was too blurry to see his face clearly, but his posture was distinct. And his left hand, resting on the doorframe, showed 2 fingers curled inward. The man with the claw hand. He was here at the livery before the fire. The conspiracy now had a face, or at least a hand, and it was connected to the very town where the official search for Alina Vance was based. This meant the cover-up wasn't just orchestrated from Frankfurt by politicians. It had boots on the ground. It had someone who could move through the community without raising alarm. A sheriff, a deputy, a trusted local hired for the job. Clara took the photo to Iris, the woman in the retirement home. She showed her the image on her laptop. Iris peered at it, her eyesight faded but her memory sharp. She pointed a bony finger at the figure. "The coat is different," she said, "but the way he stands, yes, I think that's him, the scared, angry man." So the same man seen fleeing the creek where Alina disappeared was also present at the livery where her horse was destroyed. He was the connective tissue. He was the operative. If she could identify him, she could trace the chain of command all the way back to Senator Galt. She started digging into local records from that era, census data, voter rolls, business licenses. She was looking for a man with a hand deformity living in or around Hayden in 1930. The search was slow, like sifting sand. And as she worked, she felt a growing unease. Her online searches for Red Star Land and Cattle Company and Senator Thaddeus Galt started yielding strange results. Obituary pages for minor local historians who'd written about the era. Broken links to digitized newspaper archives that had been accessible weeks before. It felt less like coincidence and more like a digital door being quietly closed ahead of her. Then the email arrived. It was sent from a generic-looking address with no subject line. The body contained only a link to a scanned, typewritten document. It was a page from what appeared to be a private investigator's report, dated April 15, 1930. The client was listed as the Kentucky Medical Advancement Fund. The subject, disposition of the EV matter. The report was cold, clinical. It described the recovery of the subject's horse from Red Bird Creek. It noted the subject herself was not recovered, presumed lost. And then, the chilling final line, loose end regarding the animal has been addressed via thermal event at Hayden. No further action required. Consider matter closed. Someone had just handed her a smoking gun, a document that explicitly tied the political fund to the cover-up of Alina's disappearance and the destruction of evidence. But who? And why? It felt like a gift, and in her experience, gifts from strangers in a murder investigation were usually traps. Was she being set up? Was the document a forgery meant to discredit her if she went public? Or was it a genuine leak from someone inside the old power structure? Someone with a guilty conscience? Before she could decide, her phone rang. It was Ben, the geologist. His voice was tense with excitement. "Clara, those samples you asked me to hypothetically test, I ran them. The water sediment from below the old Red Star pasture is saturated with tremetol. Historical levels are off the charts, and I found something else. My lab partner ran a spectral analysis on the soil. There are also high concentrations of arsenic." Clara was confused. Arsenic wasn't from snakeroot, Ben explained. White snakeroot poisoning is accidental. Cattle eat it in the woods. Arsenic in pasture soil isn't accidental. In the 1920s, arsenic was used as a pesticide and a cattle dip. But these levels, this is deliberate, repeated application. This isn't just poisoned land, Clara. Someone was enhancing the poison. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. It wasn't a cover-up of negligent grazing. It was a cover-up of deliberate poisoning. The cattle weren't just sick, they were being made sicker. The human illnesses downstream weren't an unfortunate side effect. They were perhaps the entire point. Create a public health crisis, blame the untrained frontier nurses for failing to handle it, and use the scandal to push them out. Alina Vance hadn't just stumbled upon a crime. She had stumbled upon the strategy. The land wasn't an investment, it was a weapon. The scale of the malice was staggering. It meant the political attack on the Frontier Nursing Service wasn't just political, it was chemical. It was biological warfare against a population to discredit a group of women. And Alina Vance, with her notebook and her questions, had uncovered the recipe. Clara knew she had to go public, but with what? A 90-year-old diary, a leaked document of questionable provenance and soil samples. She needed a human source. She needed the man with the claw hand. She doubled down on her search, now using paid genealogical databases. She cross-referenced the 1930 census for men in Haydn with occupations like laborer, stockman, or hand. And then she found him. In the 1940 census, a man named Walter Walt Sykes, age 42, listed as a farm manager. His household included his wife and 2 children, and in the notes field added by the enumerator in parentheses, right hand disabled, she had a name. Tracking Walt Sykes's lineage led her to a granddaughter living in Indianapolis. Clara called her, posing as a genealogist researching Kentucky families. The woman was friendly, talkative. Yes, her grandfather Walt had worked for a big cattle company back in Kentucky before moving north for factory work. She said he never talked about those days, got quiet if asked. He died in 1978. But then she offered, "I've got a box of his old things in my attic if you want to look." Nothing much, just some papers. Clara was on the road within the hour. The box was a time capsule of a modest life. Pay stubs, a fishing license, birthday cards, and at the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small ledger. It wasn't a personal diary, it was a work log. Entries listed dates, tasks, and payments, and the payments weren't from Red Star. They were from a KMAF discretionary account, the Kentucky Medical Advancement Fund. The entries were mundane: fence repair, North Pasture, delivery of feed supplement. But the amounts paid were huge for the work described. Then she found the entry dated February 12, 1930. The task was listed as road maintenance, Red Bird Creek Crossing. Payment, $200, a fortune at the time. The next entry, February 21st, secure livestock transport. Payment, $100. And a final note scribbled in the margin next to that entry, met C at livery, job done. Walt Sykes was on the payroll. He was at the creek on the day Alina disappeared. He was at the livery the night the horse was burned. And C, who was C? The manager, the man in the suit. Clara's mind raced back to the archivist who had stonewalled her, the one with the genteel manner. His name was Charles Edgerton. Could C be Charles? Was the institutional guardian of the Frontier Nursing Service's history also a participant in its darkest secret? The thought was vertigo-inducing. It meant the cover-up had infiltrated the very organization built to honor these women's legacy. It meant the truth had been guarded, not just by time, but by a keeper of the flame. Clara left Indianapolis with the ledger, her heart a drumbeat of fear and triumph. She had the name of the operative. She had the financial link to the political fund. She had the geologist's report. She had Aliner's diary. It was enough. It was more than enough. She drafted an article, weaving the evidence together into a devastating narrative. She sent it to a respected historical journal and a major newspaper's investigative desk. Then she waited. The response was not what she expected. The historical journal sent a polite rejection, citing unverifiable sourcing. The newspaper never replied. A week later, she received a letter on formal letterhead from the Frontier Nursing Services Board of Directors. It expressed deep concern over her unfounded allegations, which slander the memory of a heroic institution and its dedicated servants. It was a cease and desist in all but name, threatening legal action if she continued to publish defamatory fabrications. It was signed by the board chairman, an old, respected name in Kentucky philanthropy, and a last name that made Clara's breath catch. It was the same last name as the lawyer who had been the listed director of the Red Star Land and Cattle Company in 1930. The conspiracy wasn't buried in the past. Its heirs were still in power, sitting on boards, writing polite letters that carried the weight of law and reputation. Clara was no longer investigating a crime. She was at war with a legacy. And as she stared at the letter, a new, more terrifying question emerged. Aliner Vance had been silenced for what she knew. What would they do to Clara McCullough, who not only knew it but could prove it? The blizzard that took Aliner was a force of nature. The storm coming for Clara would be made of paper, lawyers, and old money, and she had to decide, right now, if she was going to ride into it. Clara framed the cease and desist letter and hung it above her desk. It wasn't a threat, it was confirmation. She found the nerve. The next morning, she didn't send her article to another institution. She built a website. She called it the Aliner Vance Project. She scanned every page of the diary, every entry from Walt Sykes's ledger, the soil analysis report, the leaked investigator's document, and the photograph of the man with the claw hand. She wrote the story in plain, relentless prose. She posted it all at once, at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, and then she went to bed. When she woke up, her website had crashed from traffic. It had been shared by a popular history blogger, then picked up by a regional news outlet. By afternoon, reporters from Louisville and Lexington were calling. The story had the one thing modern media craved, a 90-year-old mystery with a paper trail. It also had heroes and villains. The board of the Frontier Nursing Service issued another statement, this time calling Clara's work a tragic misunderstanding of history. But the tone had shifted from legal threat to defensive plea. The dam was cracking. Then the email arrived. It was from a woman named Leela, who identified herself as the great-niece of Charles Egerton, the archivist who had stonewalled Clara. "My great-uncle Charlie died 10 years ago," she wrote, "but before he passed, he gave me a sealed envelope. He told me to open it if anyone ever asked about the Vance matter. I didn't understand until I read your site. I have it. I'll send it to you." The package arrived 2 days later. Inside was a single-typed page and a small, faded photograph. The page was a memo from Charles Egerton to himself, dated 1985. It read, "Spoke with Walt Sykes today at the nursing home. He is frail but clear. He confirmed the events of February 12th and 21st, 1930. He was paid by the KMAF through their agent, a man named Carter. His task on the 12th was to delay the nurse at the creek crossing until the storm was at its worst. He tampered with the bridge plank. He did not see her fall. He assumed she perished. On the 21st, he met Carter at the livery to ensure the horse was destroyed. He expressed remorse. He asked if the nurse had family. I told him she did not. He wept. I have decided to keep this account private. The service's work is too important to be tarnished by the sins of old men. But the truth should not die with me. Layla, if you read this, know that I was trying to protect something good." The photograph was of a young woman standing beside a horse. On the back, in elegant cursive, was written, "Aliner Vance, Red Bird District, 1929, a light in the dark." It was the first clear image Clara had ever seen of her. She had a steady gaze, a kind but unsmiling face, and her hand rested on the horse's neck with easy familiarity. She was real. Clara posted the memo and the photograph. The media storm became a hurricane. The historical community could no longer look away. The University of Kentucky's History Department announced it would conduct an independent review. The state attorney general's office, under public pressure, opened an inquiry into the historical allegations, citing potential ongoing issues with corporate influence in public health. But the most profound consequence was quiet. Dozens of emails began flooding Clara's inbox. They were from descendants of other frontier nurses. They told similar stories of records gone missing, of pressures, of mysterious gaps in service histories. Clara realized Alina Vance wasn't an anomaly. She was a pattern. The systematic erasure of women's medical work wasn't a conspiracy in one place. It was a cultural reflex. By targeting Alina, Clara had accidentally tapped a deep well of silenced history. 3 months later, the Frontier Nursing Service Board announced the resignation of its chairman and 2 longtime members. A new interim board was formed, with a mandate for transparency. They invited Clara to Wendover to view the complete unredacted archives. In a symbolic gesture, they asked her to help curate a new permanent exhibit, The Hidden Histories of the Frontier Nurses. Alina Vance's photograph would be at the center. Clara went. She stood in the archive she'd been barred from, now welcomed as a guest of honor. The head archivist, a new hire, handed her a small archival box. Inside were the few personal effects recovered after Alina's disappearance and kept in storage forgotten. A silver nursing pin, a broken compass, and a water-stained, folded piece of paper. Clara carefully opened it. It was a hand-drawn map of the Red Bird River district with tiny, precise notations in Alina's hand. It was the map from her diary brought to life, and in the bottom corner a note she hadn't seen in the diary. For the next one, they must know the land. Clara understood. This wasn't just evidence. It was a baton. Alina had been documenting the poisoning not just to expose a crime, but to protect the next nurse, the next family, the next community. She had been building a public health map a century ahead of her time. On her last day in Kentucky, Clara drove to Red Bird Creek. She found the spot where the old crossing had been. She took the soil sample jar from her bag and scooped up a measure of earth from the bank. Then she unfolded the modern topographical map she carried and made a small, careful mark. She wasn't closing the book on Alina Vance. She was opening a new one. The work wasn't about vindication anymore. It was about continuation. As she turned to leave, an old pickup truck rattled down the dirt road and stopped. The driver, a man with a kind, weathered face, rolled down his window. "You the historian?" he asked. Clara nodded. He looked at the creek, then back at her. "My grandma was one of Miss Alina's bobbies, born 2 years after the blizzard. She always said the nurse left something behind, more than just medicine." He paused. "She said she left a kind of courage, the kind that makes other people ask questions." He tipped his hat and drove off. Clara got in her car and started the long drive home. The mystery of the woman in the blizzard was solved, but the story of Alina Vance was just beginning, because history isn't just about what happened. It's about what we choose to remember and what we dare to do with that memory. And sometimes, the most powerful thing a hero leaves behind isn't a legend, it's a map. So what do we do with a story like Alina Vance? We can mark it solved, close the file, and move on. Or we can let it change the way we look at the world. Because for every name recovered from the archives, there are 100 still missing. For every heroic ride we remember, 1,000 were never recorded. The frontier wasn't won by lone gunslingers or cattle barons. It was sustained day after day by women like Alina, women who delivered, healed, and documented, only to have their work labeled folklore or anecdote by the official record. This erasure wasn't a passive act, it was a choice to value certain kinds of courage over others, to build monuments to battles fought with bullets while letting the battles fought with medicine and sheer stubborn compassion fade into the landscape. But history is not a set of facts, it's an argument, and every time we recover a story like this, we are making a new argument. We are saying that the map is more important than the flag. That care is as foundational to a society as conquest. That a woman riding into a blizzard with a satchel of medicine is not a supporting character in someone else's epic. She is the epic. The search for the mysterious woman in the storm doesn't end with a name and a photograph. It ends with a question we have to ask ourselves. What other maps are we missing? What other patterns of care and courage have been systematically folded, spindled, and mutilated to fit a simpler, more masculine narrative? They are everywhere. In the ledgers of wartime factories run by women, in the oral histories of grandmothers who held communities together during depressions, in the lab notes of female scientists credited only in the footnotes. Eleanor Vance's legacy is no longer a mystery, it's a methodology. It's a way of looking at the empty spaces in our history and knowing they are not empty. They are waiting. They are filled with the ghosts of women who worked, who saved, who built, and who were then instructed to be quiet, to be modest, to be forgotten. Our job is to stop forgetting, to become, like Clara, a nuisance to the gatekeepers, to be the stubborn descendant who won't let the story die. Because the truth doesn't just want to be found, it wants to be used. It wants to arm the next person who stands up to say, "This matters." The next person who looks at a blank line in a ledger and sees a life. The next person who hears a ghost of a story on the wind and decides to follow it, no matter where it leads. If this story connected with you, if it made you look at the past a little differently, then you're already part of this. Hit that subscribe button. By joining this channel, you're telling the algorithm, and more importantly, you're telling yourself, that these are the stories worth telling. That digging for the truth is worth your time. Drop a comment below with the name of a forgotten hero from your own family or hometown. Let's start building a new map together. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And remember, the next time you hear a story that seems too small to be history, look closer. It's probably the only kind of history that ever really lasts.